July 4th, 1187. The temperature on the plateau of Hattin is pushing past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere between the Sea of Galilee and the city of Tiberias, the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land is dying. Not from Saracen swords, not from arrows, from thirst. 20,000 knights, infantry, and foot soldiers are crowded onto a waterless volcanic ridge, with no route of escape and no source of water within miles. Their lips are cracked, their horses are collapsing. The smoke from burning grass fires set by Saladin's cavalry is choking the air, blinding the men, and making it nearly impossible to breathe. Some soldiers are throwing down their weapons and surrendering just to get water. Others are weeping. One chronicler wrote that the knights were so desperate they were trying to dig through the rock with their bare hands, convinced there had to be water underneath. There isn't. And standing on the hill opposite them, watching all of this unfold exactly as he had planned, is a 50-year-old Kurdish general who had spent the last 12 years engineering this moment with a precision that had never been seen before in the medieval world. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History would call him Saladin. And the weapon he used to destroy the most powerful Crusader force in history wasn't fire. It wasn't steel. It wasn't even his army's size, because the Crusaders actually outnumbered him in heavy cavalry. The weapon he used was something far more dangerous, something the Crusaders never saw coming, because they didn't recognize it for what it was until they were already standing in the middle of it. This is the story of that weapon, and why it worked. To understand what made Saladin's achievement so extraordinary, you first need to feel the weight of what he was up against. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was not some fragile outpost clinging to the edge of the desert. It was, by the standards of the medieval world, one of the most heavily fortified political entities on earth. Think about that number, 90 years. By 1187, there were men defending those walls whose grandfathers had been born there. This wasn't a colony, it was a home. And it was protected by a castle network so dense and so strategically positioned that military historians still study it today. Crac des Chevaliers, Belvoir, Montfort, Carac. These weren't just fortresses, they were statements. They were the medieval equivalent of nuclear deterrents, sitting on ridgelines and mountain passes with walls 12 feet thick, cisterns that could hold years of water, and garrisons that could repel armies 10 times their size. The Crusader military orders that staffed these fortresses, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were the most disciplined and feared heavy cavalry in the known world. They didn't break. They didn't surrender. In 200 years of Crusader warfare, no Muslim force had ever broken a full Templar charge in open battle. Not once. And yet, Saladin didn't just beat them. He annihilated them. He captured the Grand Master of the Templars. He took the King of Jerusalem prisoner. He seized the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, the object that Crusader armies literally carried into battle as divine protection. And he did all of this in a single afternoon. So what happened? To find the answer, you have to go back much further than July of 1187, because the weapon Saladin used at Hattin wasn't assembled in a week, or a month, or even a year. He spent over a decade building it. And the Crusaders never noticed, because the weapon wasn't made of iron. It was made of information, politics, psychology, and one specific understanding of human nature that the Crusaders, despite all their castles and all their cavalry, could never quite grasp. But first, you need to understand who Saladin actually was, because the man himself is the key to everything. Saladin was not born into greatness. He was not a prince. He was not the son of a caliph or a sultan. He was born in Tikrit, in what is now northern Iraq, the son of a Kurdish military governor named Ayyub. His family served powerful men. They didn't produce them. His early life was, by most accounts, remarkably unimpressive. He was reportedly shy as a child. He preferred studying theology and law to military training. His father actually worried that young Salah ad-Din didn't have the stomach for the life of a soldier. When he was assigned to the court of Nur ad-Din, the most powerful Muslim ruler of the era, Saladin spent more time in the library than on the training ground. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell the story of Saladin. The thing that actually made him dangerous wasn't his swordsmanship. It wasn't his battlefield instincts, though those were exceptional. What made Saladin uniquely lethal was that he spent his formative years surrounded by failure. He watched great commanders make catastrophic decisions. He saw Nur ad-Din, his own patron, let political rivalries fracture Muslim coalitions at exactly the moments when unified force could have driven the Crusaders into the sea. He witnessed the same pattern repeat itself year after year. The Muslim world had the numbers. It had the resources. It had, at times, the military advantage. But it kept losing because its leaders couldn't stop fighting each other long enough to fight their actual enemy. Saladin filed all of this away. His real education began in 1164, when Nur ad-Din sent an army to Egypt under the command of his general Shirkuh, and Saladin went along as a subordinate officer. Egypt was in chaos. The Fatimid Caliphate, the Shia rulers of Egypt, were collapsing from internal corruption and power struggles. The Crusaders were trying to take advantage of the vacuum. Nur ad-Din wanted to get there first. What happened over the next 5 years in Egypt would transform Saladin from a bookish subordinate into one of the most politically sophisticated operators of the medieval world. He watched Shirkuh navigate competing factions, play rivals against each other, and make and break alliances with a fluidity that left everyone else confused about who was actually in control. He saw how information, specifically who had it and who didn't, was often more decisive than military strength. And then, in 1169, Shirkuh died. And Saladin, at roughly 30 years old, found himself appointed as Vizier of Egypt, effectively the most powerful man in the country, supposedly serving the Fatimid Caliph, actually running everything. The Fatimid Caliph at the time, Al-Adid, thought he had appointed a puppet. He was wrong. Within 2 years, Saladin had systematically replaced Fatimid commanders with his own loyalists, restructured the Egyptian army, purged the palace guard, and when Al-Adid died in 1171, Saladin simply didn't replace him. He let the Fatimid Caliphate die quietly, like a fire with no oxygen. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't hold a ceremony. He just stopped mentioning the caliph in Friday prayers and named Nur ad-Din's Abbasid Caliph instead. By the time anyone realized the Fatimid dynasty was gone, it was already gone. This is the first glimpse of the weapon, not brute force, patience, and the ability to reshape a situation so completely that by the time your opponent recognizes what's happened, the world has already changed around them. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved with the same quiet efficiency. Nur ad-Din left behind a 12-year-old son. Saladin declared himself the boy's protector. Then he spent the next decade systematically absorbing Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and Yemen into his own empire. Every city he took with minimal bloodshed. He offered terms. He negotiated. He was extraordinarily generous in victory, a habit that confused his enemies who were used to conquerors who put cities to the sword. By 1183, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, most of Mesopotamia, and had surrounded the Crusader states on 3 sides. The Crusaders were watching all of this happen. They weren't stupid. They understood at the strategic level that Saladin's unification of the Muslim world around them was an existential problem. But they had a fatal misunderstanding of what Saladin was actually doing. They thought he was building an empire. He was building a trap. The weapon had 4 components. And they worked together in a way that the Crusaders, despite all their military experience, never figured out how to counter. The first component was intelligence. Saladin ran the most sophisticated intelligence network in the medieval Middle East. It wasn't a formal spy service in the modern sense. It was something more organic and, in many ways, more effective. He cultivated relationships. He had informants in the marketplaces, in the ports, in the courts of Crusader lords. Merchant caravans that moved between Muslim and Christian territory carried more than goods. They carried information. He knew when Crusader garrisons were undermanned. He knew which lords were in debt and might be susceptible to bribery. He knew about feuds between Crusader nobles, some of which were so bitter that rival lords would actually sabotage each other's military operations rather than let a rival gain glory or territory. He knew the names of knights who had been captured and released, and he tracked which of them might try to negotiate separately rather than fight. This information wasn't just tactically useful. Saladin used it to shape his campaign plans at a level that was, for the 12th century, almost incomprehensibly sophisticated. But intelligence alone doesn't win battles. The second component was psychological warfare. Saladin understood something about the Crusader kingdom that was more important than any troop count or castle survey. He understood that it was politically fractured in ways that made rational collective decision-making nearly impossible, and he spent years making it worse. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was governed by a diseased king, a faction-ridden nobility, and 2 military orders who sometimes hated each other almost as much as they hated Saladin. King Baldwin IV, the legendary leper king, had been fighting Saladin's forces with real skill and occasional brilliance throughout the late 1170s. But Baldwin was dying. His leprosy had taken his hands, his eyesight, and eventually his ability to ride a horse. He died in 1185. What followed his death was a succession crisis of almost comical dysfunction. Baldwin's nephew, a child named Baldwin V, became king. He died within a year. Then came Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had married into the Crusader royal family and was almost universally regarded as incompetent by the experienced military men around him. His coronation was contested. Half the kingdom didn't recognize him as legitimate. The master of the Templars, Gerard of Ridefort, supported Guy. The master of the Hospitallers and Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced military commanders in the region, did not. Raymond of Tripoli was so alienated from Guy's court that he actually signed a separate peace agreement with Saladin in 1186. He opened his own territory to Muslim troops and essentially told Jerusalem to manage its own problems. Saladin was watching all of this, and he was very carefully nudging it along. When Reynald of Châtillon, the Lord of Carac, attacked a Muslim caravan in 1187, breaking a truce that had been in place, Saladin didn't just respond with anger. He responded with a very deliberate and very theatrical outrage that was specifically calculated to force the Kingdom of Jerusalem to choose. Either punish Reynald themselves and humiliate their own noblemen, or stand behind Reynald and give Saladin the moral and political justification to launch his biggest campaign yet. King Guy couldn't punish Reynald. The court politics wouldn't allow it. Saladin had his justification. The third component was the most ruthless of all. Saladin had spent years studying the geography of the Crusader kingdom with one specific question in mind. Not where are the weakest points in their defenses, but where can I force them to fight me on ground that will kill them? The answer was a 9-mile strip of waterless plateau between the springs of Sapphira and the Sea of Galilee. The springs at Sapphira were the best water source in the region. The Crusader army could camp there indefinitely, supplied and hydrated, and simply refused to march unless battle was on their terms. Every experienced Crusader commander knew this. Raymond of Tripoli had said it explicitly. Stay at Sapphira, let Saladin exhaust himself attacking fortified positions, and don't be drawn into open battle in the summer heat. But to execute this strategy, you needed an army that could hold together under pressure. You needed a king who could say no to his own commanders when they demanded action. You needed political unity, all of which Saladin had spent years systematically destroying. The fourth component was bait. On June 26, 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan River with an army of roughly 30,000 men and marched to Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was the home of Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Eschiva. Raymond himself was at the Crusader military camp at Sapphira, 12 miles away. Saladin surrounded the city, and within hours his forces breached the walls. Eschiva withdrew into the citadel and sent a messenger to Raymond at Sapphira. "Help us, or we will surrender." Now Saladin waited, because this was the moment the entire previous decade had been designed to create. Raymond knew what Saladin was doing. He stood up in the war council at Sapphira and said it plainly. "This is a trap. Tiberias is my city, and my wife is in that citadel. And even I am telling you we should not march. We have the water here. We have the position. We can outlast him. The moment we march toward Tiberias, we are doing exactly what he wants." Every experienced commander in that tent agreed with Raymond. Guy of Lusignan agreed with Raymond, too, initially. He dismissed the council for the night and told his officers they would stay at Sapphira. And then Gerard of Ridefort, the master of the Templars, went back to the king's tent alone. What Gerard said to Guy that night, nobody knows with certainty, but chroniclers on both sides recorded the result. By morning, Guy had reversed his decision. The army would march to Tiberias. When Raymond heard the news, he reportedly wept. He knew. The Crusader army left Sapphira on the morning of July 3, 1187. It was a massive force. Roughly 1,200 heavy cavalry, including the elite Templar and Hospitaller contingents. 15,000 or more infantry and foot soldiers. The True Cross, carried on its wooden mount by the Bishop of Acre, moving with the army as it always did in major campaigns. 9 miles. On a good day, through open terrain with plentiful water, 9 miles is nothing. 4 hours of marching, maybe 5. But this wasn't a good day, and Saladin had made sure of it. Saladin's light cavalry had been active since dawn, harassing the column's flanks, riding in fast with arrows and retreating before the heavy knights could respond, picking off horses, forcing the infantry to stop and reform, disrupting the march's rhythm constantly. The Crusader column was moving through an area that offered no shade and no water. The temperature was climbing. By midday, The column had covered barely 4 miles. Raymond of Tripoli was leading the advance guard at the front of the column. He sent messengers back to Guy asking for a change of direction toward a village called Hattin where there was a small spring. Guy agreed. But to reach Hattin from where they were, the army had to climb onto a plateau. The horns of Hattin. The infantry, already gasping in the heat, started to collapse. Some units stopped moving entirely. A panic began spreading through the rear of the column as Saladin's cavalry pressed harder, setting fire to the dry grass and creating a rolling wall of smoke that drifted into the faces of the Crusader foot soldiers. Raymond sent another message to Guy. We have to reach the spring at Hattin. The infantry cannot go on. Guy made the decision that ended the kingdom of Jerusalem. He ordered the army to make camp on the plateau, not at the spring. On the waterless plateau, in the open, with no defensive cover, surrounded on multiple sides by Saladin's army. Raymond, at the front of the column, received the order and reportedly said something that, depending on your source, was either despairing or furious. Ah, Lord God, the war is over. We are betrayed unto death. That night on the plateau was, by every account that survives, a kind of hell. Saladin's forces ringed the plateau with fires that burned through the night. His army was singing, celebrating. Many of his soldiers were performing their evening prayers at full volume, thousands of voices rising in the darkness, a sound that Crusader chroniclers described as terrifying in its confidence and unity. The Crusader soldiers had no water. The horses were so thirsty that they were impossible to control. Men were abandoning their positions to try to reach water, wandering into the darkness, and either being killed or captured by Saladin's cavalry. By dawn on July 4th, roughly 7,000 of Guy's foot soldiers had already been killed, captured, or deserted. The army that reformed on the horns of Hattin was a fraction of what had left Safuria the morning before. Saladin watched from his command position on a nearby hill. He was calm. He had done everything he needed to do before the battle even started. The battle itself was, as he well understood, almost a formality. Raymond of Tripoli made one final attempt to break through. He led his cavalry in a charge toward a gap in Saladin's lines. Saladin's commanders, on his specific instruction, opened the lines and let Raymond through. Then they closed behind him. Raymond escaped, but he escaped with nothing into nothing. He was alive, but he had no army, no kingdom, and nothing left to fight for. He would be dead of illness within months. The rest of the battle was systematic. The Templar and Hospitaller cavalry charged again and again, because charging was the only tactic they had. Saladin's forces simply absorbed the charges, pulled back, and shot the horses. Without their horses, the heavy knights were enormously expensive soldiers wearing 300 pounds of equipment who couldn't run. The true cross fell to Saladin's forces by mid-morning. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured by early afternoon, sitting in his tent, which had been pitched on the battlefield, as a signal to his troops that there would be no retreat. There was no retreat because there was nowhere to retreat to. The numbers from the aftermath are staggering. Most of the Crusader heavy cavalry was either killed or captured. The Templar and Hospitaller prisoners, roughly 200 knights, were executed on Saladin's order, done individually by religious volunteers from his army rather than by soldiers, because Saladin wanted them understood as a religious act rather than a military one. The ordinary soldiers were sold into slavery. So many prisoners flooded the slave markets in Damascus that the price of a slave dropped to the cost of a pair of sandals. Reynold of Chatillon, the man whose caravan raid had given Saladin his justification, was brought before Saladin personally. Saladin offered him water, then withdrew it, then killed him with his own hands. Because Crusader custom held that offering water to a prisoner constituted a guarantee of his safety, and Saladin wanted Reynold dead but wouldn't violate his own hospitality code to do it. The detail matters. Even in his most decisive moment, Saladin was thinking about optics. With the Crusader field army destroyed at Hattin, the cities and fortresses of the kingdom fell like dominoes. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon. City after city opened its gates within weeks because the forces that would have defended them were dead or enslaved on a plateau in Galilee. Jerusalem held out until October, when the city's defenders realized they had no relief force coming, no army to rescue them, no hope of military salvation. They began negotiating terms. The man conducting the defense was Balian of Ibelin, one of the few senior Crusader nobles who had not been at Hattin. Balian rode to Saladin's camp under flag of truce and made his case. He had no real leverage. Saladin held all the cards. But what happened in that negotiation tells you everything about what kind of man Saladin actually was. Balian told Saladin that if Jerusalem fell by assault, the Christian defenders would destroy every holy site in the city rather than let them fall into Muslim hands. They would kill their own Muslim prisoners. They would level the Dome of the Rock before surrendering it. Saladin believed him, or at least took the threat seriously enough to negotiate. They agreed on terms. Every Christian in Jerusalem could ransom themselves out of the city. The poor would be allowed to leave. There would be no massacre. The Holy Sepulchre would remain a Christian church. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin rode into Jerusalem. He did not harm the population. He did not damage the churches. When his soldiers began looting, he stopped them. He personally ransomed thousands of poor Christians who could not afford their own ransom price. The contrast with the original Crusader conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 was stark and deliberate. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they had massacred the population for 3 days. The streets, according to multiple contemporary accounts, ran with blood. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians had been slaughtered without distinction. Saladin's conquest was silent, ordered, almost gentle. That too was part of the weapon. Because Saladin understood something that many conquerors never figured out. A city you take by massacre is a city that will hate you forever, and every neighboring city will fight to the death rather than surrender to you. A city you take by negotiation becomes an example. It becomes proof that surrender is survivable. It makes the next city more likely to negotiate and less likely to make you bleed for it. Every city that fell without a fight after Hattin was, in some sense, a consequence of how Saladin treated Jerusalem. The news reached Europe in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Jerusalem fallen, the true cross captured, the king a prisoner, the military orders destroyed. Pope Urban III, according to contemporary accounts, died of shock on the day he heard the news. The Third Crusade was called within months. Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I of Germany took the cross. The most powerful coalition of European monarchs ever assembled would set out to retake Jerusalem. They would never succeed. Saladin held Jerusalem until his death in 1193, and the city would not return to Christian hands again until 1229, through a negotiation rather than a military victory, which was, in its own way, another tribute to the diplomatic tradition Saladin had established. For 800 years, historians and military scholars have been picking apart the Battle of Hattin, trying to understand how it happened. The most common analysis focuses on Guy of Lusignan's decision to march, as if the battle was essentially a single bad choice made by one weak king on one bad night. That framing misses the point entirely. What Saladin built at Hattin wasn't a trap that snapped shut in a single day. It was the product of 12 years of continuous preparation, operating simultaneously across intelligence, diplomacy, politics, geography, and psychology. Each component reinforced the others. The intelligence network fed the political manipulation. The political manipulation deepened the Crusaders' internal divisions. The internal divisions made rational military decision-making impossible. The geographical trap only worked because the Crusaders arrived at the worst possible moment, with a fractured, exhausted, politically compromised command structure. Remove any one of those components and Hattin doesn't happen. Saladin didn't just outfight the Crusaders. He outthought them across a timescale they weren't even aware they were operating in. The Crusaders, for all their martial skill, were essentially reactive. They responded to events, they defended positions. They made decisions in the moment based on immediate pressures, which is, actually, quite reasonable behavior for military organizations operating under constant threat. But reactive decision-making has a fundamental vulnerability. Someone who is planning multiple moves ahead can make the reactive response become the trap. Guy marched because he felt he had to. The court politics made staying at Sephuria impossible, once Gerard of Riedfort made it a question of personal courage versus military prudence. The same court politics that made marching feel inevitable had been stoked for years by Saladin's intelligence operations, which fed the rivalry between Raymond and the Templar faction, which turned what should have been a straightforward military debate into a political landmine. The decision to march felt, in that tent at Sephuria, like a choice. It wasn't. It was the last step in a sequence that had been laid down long before. There's a principle in strategic thinking that historians sometimes call the long game, the ability to set conditions rather than respond to them. To work backward from the outcome you want and build the circumstances that make that outcome inevitable, rather than simply reacting to whatever circumstances you find yourself in. Saladin played the long game at a level that was almost unprecedented in his era. He made alliances he knew he'd break later, because their temporary value was worth the eventual cost. He showed mercy he didn't have to show, because mercy was an investment in future compliance. He restrained his army when lesser generals would have pressed the attack, because he understood that patience was a force multiplier. He tolerated his own subordinates' failures with remarkable equanimity, because punishing every mistake destroys the initiative that makes subordinates useful in the first place. Contemporary sources, both Muslim and Christian, describe Saladin in remarkably similar terms: disciplined, intellectually curious, devout without fanaticism, generous to the point that his own treasury officials despaired of him because he gave away money and gifts constantly, capable of ruthlessness, the execution of the Templar prisoners, the killing of Reynald, but he chose those moments carefully and for specific strategic reasons, rather than from habit or anger. The chronicler Ibn Shaddad, who served as Saladin's close companion and biographer for much of the final decade of his life, wrote that he never saw Saladin express personal hatred for the Crusaders. He saw them as a problem to be solved, not a people to be destroyed. That distinction mattered enormously in how he operated. Richard I of England, who arrived in the Holy Land in 1191 as part of the Third Crusade and spent 2 years trying to reverse what Saladin had done, never managed to retake Jerusalem despite defeating Saladin's forces in the field at Arsuf and Jaffa. The military results were simply irreversible. The towns were gone. The fortresses were either destroyed or regarrisoned. The Crusader kingdom that Richard was trying to restore existed only in fragments along the coast. Richard and Saladin never met in person, despite a prolonged and somewhat famous correspondence. They exchanged gifts, negotiated through intermediaries, and by multiple contemporary accounts had a mutual respect that both seemed to find slightly inconvenient, given that they were, technically, trying to kill each other. The treaty they eventually signed in 1192 allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem but didn't restore Christian rule. Saladin kept the city. Saladin died in Damascus on March 4, 1193, 18 months after signing the peace treaty with Richard. He was 55 or 56 years old. He had been ill for months, drained by decades of continuous campaigning. When his treasurer opened his personal accounts to pay for the funeral, there was almost nothing there. Saladin had given it away. A man who had controlled the wealth of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia died with 47 Naseri dirhams and a single gold piece to his name. His empire fragmented almost immediately after his death, divided among his sons and brothers who, with considerable historical irony, spent the next several decades fighting each other in ways that bore a striking resemblance to the Crusader court politics Saladin had exploited so effectively. But the legacy didn't fragment. In the Islamic world, Saladin became the model of what a just ruler and a successful warrior statesman could look like. His name became synonymous with chivalry, and not just in the Islamic tradition. In European medieval literature, Saladin appears as a figure of nobility and honor in texts ranging from Dante's Divine Comedy, where he appears alongside the great pagan philosophers in Limbo, to Boccaccio's Decameron, where he is depicted as a model of generosity. This is genuinely unusual. A man who destroyed the Crusader kingdom was praised in European literature as a paragon of chivalric virtue within a generation of his death. That doesn't happen by accident. It reflects the reality that even his enemies recognized what they had encountered. Not just a great general. A man who had built something at a systemic level that the medieval world didn't quite have the vocabulary to describe. The modern vocabulary might call it grand strategy. The simultaneous management of military, diplomatic, economic, informational, and political power toward a unified long-term objective. Military academies today still teach Hattin. They teach it as a case study in strategic encirclement, in the denial of resources as a force multiplier, in the weaponization of an enemy's internal politics. But what the best analysts take from it goes beyond any single tactical lesson. The deepest lesson from Hattin is about the relationship between time and power. Saladin understood that power isn't just what you have in the moment. Power is the accumulation of conditions over time, set up so that the moment arrives on your terms rather than your enemy's terms. The battle at Hattin was not decided on July 4, 1187. It was decided across 12 years of patient, precise preparation. The Crusaders weren't stupid, they had brilliant commanders. Raymond of Tripoli saw the trap clearly and said so. His analysis was exactly correct. But he was operating inside a political system that Saladin had spent years compromising. And within that compromised system, the right military decision was politically impossible to make. That is the weapon, not the fires on the hillside, not the waterless plateau, not even the 12 years of buildup. The weapon was the construction of a situation in which the enemy's own decision-making process became the instrument of their destruction. The horns of Hattin today are a quiet place. Farmers work the fields around the Twin Peaks. Tourists visit occasionally, standing on the ridge where Crusader knights once died of thirst within sight of the Sea of Galilee. The rock is the same rock. The sun is the same sun. The silence is the kind that only settles over places where history happened so completely that the land itself still seems to be processing it. 837 years later, Saladin's name is still known on every continent. The Kingdom of Jerusalem has been gone for 7 centuries. The true cross was never recovered, and the weapon that brought it all down was never something the Crusaders could have picked up and examined. It wasn't a siege engine or a new blade. It was the slow, methodical, patient understanding that a battle is only the last step in a process that started long before the first arrow flies. Saladin started that process before most of his enemies had even heard his name. By the time they understood what was happening, it was already over. The thing about history's greatest strategists is that they rarely get remembered for their actual genius. They get remembered for the dramatic moment, the battle, the conquest, the crown. What you almost never hear about is the decade before, the patience before the victory, the deliberate groundwork that made the dramatic moment inevitable. Saladin's secret weapon was time, used deliberately, systematically, and with a precision that most of his contemporaries couldn't have conceived of, let alone replicated. It didn't just win him a battle, it changed the world. If you found this history interesting, there is a lot more where this came from. The story of how the Third Crusade tried and failed to undo what happened at Hattin, the remarkable correspondence between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, and the internal collapse of the Crusader political system that made Hattin possible in the first place. All of that is worth its own video. Until then, the comments section is open. What aspect of Saladin's strategy do you find most striking? The intelligence operations, the political manipulation, or the geographical trap? Let's talk about it.